Good morning. My name is Dave Nicolai. I'm the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm a crops educator located at the Farmington Regional Office and also on St. Paul campus. We want to welcome you to our final installment for the winter season on strategic farming. Let's Talk Crops program, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we have planned for this summer at the conclusion of today's program. Today's topics will be fine-tuning crop nutrient and weed management for March 30th, 2022. We're very happy that these sessions are brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension and generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, along with the Minnesota Corn Growers Research and Promotion Council as well. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started this morning. We will be having the program actually split into two halves. We'll be starting with the crop nutrient emphasis, and then at 9:30 we'll have a hard break and then conclude with the weed science and weed management topics as we go forward. We have recorded all of these sessions throughout the wintertime, and they will be posted on our strategic farming webpage. And so you can go back and listen to previous ones as well as a week or so after this to the present program with that. So that's the announcements here. I have a co-host. Liz Stahl is also a crops educator located out of the Worthington Regional Office, and she's going to help us to stay on track and manage the questions as they come forward. So with that, now without any further ado, I'm going to just bring on our first panelist, Brad Carlson, a co-worker in Extension working with the Water Resources area. And he's out of southern Minnesota. I'm presently down there this morning at Mankato, and Brad, looking out my window, we got a little rain, little snow mix here. Certainly doesn't look like we'll be in the field at least today, but maybe you can preface a little bit with what's going on in Minnesota and what does the data tell us?
Yeah, and Dan and I will be doing the nutrient management part here this morning, and we were on the road just this last week doing our last nitrogen smart trainings, and I know we saw still quite a bit of snow out in the field as we were kind of in that northern west central area, kind of north I-94, Alexandria, Elbow Lake, Monoman, kind of that area. And then when we got south, the snow kind of disappeared, but it's still pretty evident that there's still quite a bit of frost in the soil just on account of the ponded water. I do have a couple of slides I'm going to share here just because I had them already and they're sort of relevant. So I'm going to just kind of show this. This is the average soil temperature at Waseca. And so you can kind of see where we are at with this. For right now, typically speaking, this being 6 inches, the frost will be out of the soil in March. But I think it's worth noting that there's still frost deeper than that. I know I was talking to a farmer a couple of days ago who was burying some stumps, and he said it was down at about a foot. And I know we talked to Jeff Vetch yesterday at Waseca, and he confirmed that their soil temperature probes are also kind of reporting that. And so given that, we're still kind of keeping a lot of moisture at the top. We still do have a moisture deficit in the soil profile in most of south central Minnesota, but the western part of the state is quite different. These are some graphs that were shared with me from the Lamberton Research Station. I'll call your attention particularly to the bottom one. That black line is the average soil moisture in the profile. And so we look at usually having a maximum in the vicinity of about 8 inches of available soil water. You can see that it reached some pretty catastrophic lows. But starting in the middle of August, it actually started raining and picked up to the point where now the available soil water on the western side of the state is actually above average right now. And so that will have some implications relative to field work and nutrient management. One of the areas that we have been really hitting hard related to our area of focus, and particularly with nitrogen, is that because of how dry it was last year, there is the potential for some fairly significant carryover of soil nitrate. If you take a look at this chart, the top one, you'll see the drought severity index, and you'll see towards the left side the drought of the late 1980s. And you can see on the bottom the chart of the total nitrogen load entering the Twin Cities, particularly the blue bars of the Minnesota River. You can see how that spiked after that drought, and we see that historically. Following droughts, we'll see nitrate levels in surface water go up quite a bit, and it's because of accumulated nitrates that end up flushing out into the water. And so the point we've been trying to make with folks is that there is the opportunity actually to account for this and to reduce your nitrogen fertilizer inputs based on what is residual. We have a soil nitrate test at our disposal in Minnesota. We look at doing that to the depth of 2 feet. And primarily, historically, we would look at that in continuous corn situations, kind of flagging where there may be unused fertilizer from last year, but also fields with a long-term manure history. We like to see that test taken as close to the time that we're going to apply fertilizer, or actually as close to the time that the crop needs the nutrient as possible. The results are going to be accurate. It's just that the question would be whether the nitrate is still there based on what the weather conditions are like. The point being, there could be a lot of nitrogen out there. Minnesota Valley Testing Labs shared with us some data that they had, and it shows that of samples that were submitted last fall, that roughly 70% of those samples showed a nitrogen credit, and some of them quite significant. You'll see that almost a third of those, 28%, were in the 18 parts per million range or higher. Our recommendations say that's a credit of 155 pounds of nitrogen. So basically almost a full rate. In fact, 18% were 24 parts per million. That's above our recommended range, but I would say that probably is a credit, maybe 180 or even 200 pounds potentially. So the thing about this is this wasn't a random sample. These were submitted from places where farmers, consultants, agronomists thought there probably would be a nitrogen credit this year, but the bottom line is they found it in most cases. And so if you have that situation, we're encouraging you to kind of look for that this year. I guess a few things. I'm going to skip that. Remember that this is our test goes to 2 feet. If you take a test or take a soil sample, it's only 6 inches deep, like you would do for P and K, and have that test for nitrate. That's going to show a number that's much higher than what a 2-foot sample would be, and so it'd give you sort of a false positive. And we really can't interpret those numbers. Remember, nitrate is mobile in the soil profile, and so it is possible for it to move, and in all likelihood did. So that's why we want to get that thing down to 2 feet. Again, with the soil conditions right now, the field conditions being so wet and the frost not really being out fully, I don't know how many people will actually be out in the field taking this test. And for another week or two, possibly. And of course, at that point, a lot of guys are going to be really ready to get out and do field work. So I guess you're going to have to judge accordingly. The things I want to remind everyone, though, is this only tests nitrate. So if you applied some fertilizer last fall, this is not going to give you an indication of what's still available. If that is still in the ammonium form and not converted to nitrate, it is not going to show that. The other thing is we give our results, or we interpret our results in parts per million. And so the test that is frequently run in advance of sugar beets gives it in pounds per acre. The big difference here is if you look at our recommendations, we would give a credit of 0 to 6 parts per million as 0 credit. And so that's sort of assuming a background level. Those numbers that come back for that sugar beet test basically start at 0. And so you would need to subtract that amount right off the top before considering that to be a credit. And so I guess that's the main points. As far as to what extent we see farmers still having the ability to use that this spring, a lot of it's going to have to do with timing. But when we talk about dealing with the high cost of fertilizer, really, this is a pretty good convergence of the fact it was dry last year, and we have a tool at our disposal to lower the amount of nitrogen input based on that. it's really, I would suggest a lot of guys really should take advantage of that.
We have Dr. Dan Kaiser on from the University of Minnesota. He's our extension soils specialist, spends a lot of time working with not only P and K, but also with nitrogen. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to unmute yourself and maybe talk a little bit about price ratios, a nitrogen calculator, and if you choose not to or can't make the soil test, what other opportunities are there for people to zero in on nitrogen recommendations? And so I'm going to let you go ahead here and explain what you have for the folks to look at on the screen.
So I'm just going to show a couple things here. I mean, recently I went through some of the 2021 data, and I'm in the process of updating the nitrogen guidelines. One of the advantages with the system we have is it is based on economics. So we can account for that easier, and it's a lot easier to do with nitrogen than it is with some of the other crops. So that'll be the main thing that you'll likely be seeing here. I don't know when that's going to go live. I've been working with getting the actual web calculator updated. So that's been a work in progress. The actual publication is what I'm working on right now. So I'll show you that table. I'll be going into the publication here in a moment. These are just looking at the trends. I was kind of interested to see when we input the data, what the actual numbers were going to come back in terms of our average trends, because I've been tracking this since I took over the corn N rate calculator database just to see kind of yearly what was happening. And corn on corn, I've been talking a lot about this when I talk about this, that we've seen this upward trend since 2000. The thing looking at though, looking at 2014 when we hit a dry spell in some spots, and then looking at the last 3 years that we're seeing a downtick in our yearly average. And some of this could be kind of what Brad was showing before with some of this carryover, particularly with continuous corn. If we have some nitrate carryover that could be being picked up here, and why we're seeing a lowering of those numbers. I don't really know that. Looking at the numbers, what we've been seeing with continuous corn in some of the studies, it does concern me a little bit with the recommendations being lowered with the price ratio where it's at. That it's one that tends to get hit a little bit harder. But if we are seeing some carryover, that could be the benefit, going into this with nitrogen prices the way they are. We could take advantage of some of that and hopefully lower some of or at least get to higher yields with some of the lower rates we're recommending based on the price ratio that we're at right now. Corn, soybean have been relatively flat. You look on the right, you see another downtick here too this last year. We did see, in general, see if I can get this to go, a general increase though with the update. I haven't updated the guidelines since 2020 through 2019 data. So we've got, or actually it was 2019 with 2018 now. Looking at if you were fertilizing fall close to the 0.1 with the changes, now we're closer to the 0.15 this spring, where we're at with our price ratio. I mean, the numbers are pretty similar. We saw generally about a 10-pound increase in the recommended rates with that last update. I think looking at some of the numbers I've been hearing for prices, we're going to be, slightly higher than at a 0.15, probably closer to a 0.18. Though looking at the difference when we start getting to that expensive nitrogen with both of these, you're not seeing as much of a difference in terms of going between those price ratios. So it's going to be roughly maybe about a 5-pound difference if you look at that 0.18 versus 0.15. So you're going to be within that profitable range. Really looking at managing within 5 pounds isn't that big of a deal. So typically we did a 0.05 and a 0.2 with the table. I dropped those to try to go towards a situation where we're more likely going to see historically the numbers range within 0.075 between 0.15. That's kind of where we still see things with the majority of the time. The ratio is at 0.15 with that.
Dan, do you quickly want to just mention to the folks again, how do you calculate the ratio, the pound of a nitrogen, bushel of corn here, how we get those numbers?
You just take the price per unit and divide by your what I've been using generally is fall prices for corn.
I might mention here,
looking at kind of where we're at, about $1 to $1.05. Go ahead, Brad.
No, I was just going to say I did some calling around in advance of this yesterday to a couple of fertilizer dealers. And what I've currently got for anhydrous price is about $15.75 a ton. For urea, it was about $9.75 a ton. So that calculates out to about 95 cents a pound for anhydrous and about $1.05 for urea. The UAN came back at about 750. Then I got prices for some of the other P and K and some of that stuff. But the October price at a local ethanol plant close to here right now, I guess if you know where I'm from, you know which plant that probably was. October, they're contracting at 622. So if you use that for the anhydrous price and that corn price, that's a price ratio of 0.15. And if you use the urea price, it's like 0.17, 0.175, something like that.
So that obviously with the table, and they can, Dan, I know it's in process a little bit on the nitrogen calculator, but yet you can go and online and use it presently with that, maybe that 0.15, 0.17 price ratio in there. But it definitely obviously makes a difference in the recommendations, particularly on a corn situation.
Yeah, that's where you're going to see it bigger. I mean, if you want to play around with the exact values, I do round. The table that you're seeing is rounded to the nearest 5. I do that for the publication because that hedges a little bit for yearly changes that I won't need to change the publication as much. And if it's within a couple pounds, I don't think any of you are really going to be managing, and it's going to make a whole lot of difference. And so that's kind of why I typically round. So you're going to find numbers slightly different on the calculator than what you're going to find here. P and K right now, really, it's going to be kind of where you're at for soil tests. I mean, I'm assuming quite a bit of it's been put down. But the easiest one right now for me in terms of if I have to cut or look at reducing significantly is phosphate, particularly if you're in a situation where you've built your soil test to about 20 part per million or above. We know that, and it was one of the questions, the pre-questions that came up asking about if we did cut, what was going to happen with your soil tests. That on average, if you look at long-term, and, I look at soil test change over a number of years, at least 5, that it's roughly about a 2 part per million average decrease without any phosphate applied. Generally, you're not going to run into problems with phosphorus until you get closer to 10. I mean, between 15 and 20, if you're maintaining in there, if you've got a starter option, that's not a bad thing to consider if you're looking at or reducing something. Potash right now is the one I don't know. With the dry years we've had, it's been a stronger response to it just because of the dry weather conditions. It's one that I would just, kind of look at and say, if you're in those marginal ranges, particularly if you're closer to 150 part per million, that's where I get a little concerned. We are in the process of doing some updates to those guidelines. I likely won't have those out until I'd say the end of the summer. The only change that you're going to likely see for those that may be managing down in the far southeast or on sands, and we may have a different set of guidelines for what's a good target point for what we deem our critical level. Historically, it was 150 pounds or 160 pounds was kind of the critical level. I think that fits pretty well with some of the silt loams in the southeast. The sands, lower than that, there's just situations you can't really build. So that would be the major change. As they're written now, they are really more of the higher clay soils across the majority of the state. They fit that 200 part per million range. So that's the major change you're likely going to see. And if you're in the southeast, say, I got to cut a little on potash too. I mean, there's a little more wiggle room on some of those soils versus some of those areas. I mean, nitrogen, sulfur, the two that, since they're mobile, are going to be kind of the harder two on the cut side, particularly nitrogen. But again, we built economics into those recommendations.
So to summarize, your confidence level, if you have a recent soil test or, obviously that you're comfortable in, and if you're in that above that 150 parts per million on the potassium, and if you're 15, 20, certainly at that 20 on phosphorus, you have a lot more room to make some decisions if you have a particular field where you might, not have the opportunity or need the opportunity to make an application there, and maybe just start or skip it their situation and concentrate more on the nitrogen. But those are some of the levels that'll be on the tables. And I think they'll be on our University of Minnesota Soils website as well.
Actually, 200 for K, Dave. If you're above 200, I have far fewer concerns. If you're in the far southeast on some of the silt loam soils, 160, probably is a good target point. Sands, we'll need something, but generally sands, we aren't seeing as strong of a response. We're a lot of it. We've got an e-news release coming out at some point here that will explain some of this, because we've been looking at the mineralogy of the clays across the state. It's kind of interesting. It starts to fit a little bit what I'm seeing with kind of what we're seeing in the field with responses. So, I mean, again, it's you look at our recommendations, that'll be the main change, is we may have different classes for different soil types. In terms of what we'd recommend for a build point or a max point, beyond which you won't see a response decay generally.
Brad, there was a couple of questions that came in. One is that you had a decision tree on slide 6. The other one, there was a question about, is there a formula for converting soil nitrate parts per million into available pounds of nitrogen?
Yeah, so the one about the decision tree, I kind of glossed over that. I guess under normal circumstances, and I kind of already mentioned this, if you drill down on that decision tree, the places where we primarily look at taking a soil nitrate test and using it to lower nitrogen application rates is primarily corn on corn following a dry year, and then in fields that have a long-term manure history, kind of regardless of what the crop rotation is. That's all that decision tree is saying. Now, the thing that I'd like to point out is that if you take that test under any circumstance, if you feel like doing it, and look at the work and the cost, if it gives you back a number, it's real. That's just where the likelihood is of finding a positive result. But if you want to take that test on any given field, that's fine. Now, of course, any of our fields that are in a corn bean rotation, the likelihood is going to be much higher following corn that there's residual nitrate, particularly unused fertilizer from last year, rotating into beans. What difference does it make? So that's, of course, something you need to consider. And of course, where we had soybeans last year, there wasn't a nitrogen fertilizer application. So you only would be looking at residual soil nitrate accumulated from mineralization post-growing season under those circumstances. And I think particularly in western Minnesota where it got wet, maybe not so much of that. So there is that. Now, the Dan typed in an answer about converting the soil nitrate to nitrogen. I just want to again reiterate that some of the tests that happen are kind of relative to the pre-sugar beet test, which starts at 0 instead of starting at 6 part per million. And as well as the recommendation for that pre-sugar beet test is to take that to 4 feet deep. I don't know how many people do that, but that's what the recommendation is. When I had a conversation with John Lamb, who developed that and is retired now, John had suggested that we use about 60% of the in pounds per acre of nitrogen to be actually available versus that entire number. And I know that the reason we have sort of a stair-step categories related to the parts per million is relative to bounce in the numbers and the response back when that research was originally done. And so I'm kind of shy about using a real precise number, like getting that parts per million and then calculating it to the exact pounds per acre. That may be a little aggressive at some points. And so the recommendations we have are being fairly conservative, or in essence, what we really can count on. So that's primarily what we think relative to that. I want to we're getting close to the time here. I want to hit another question or two that was sent in ahead of time. One was relative to nitrogen stabilizers and whether they would play a larger role in 2022. At this point in time, we don't probably look at that being, if we're talking about nitrification inhibitors, that being really all that significant. Remember that those things do wear off, similar to how nitrogen will convert in the nitrogen cycle based on time and temperature. We're getting so late into the season now. If you look at the average accumulation of heat units, which starts on May 1st, just based on averages, we'll hit V4 in roughly that second week of June. The odds of losing applied nitrogen kind of between the time you're going to actually get out there and June 4th aren't real high. Particularly considering soil temperatures are cold and we won't see a lot of denitrification under that circumstance. And so from that standpoint, while the nitrification inhibitors work, we just don't look at them necessarily paying off as being necessary. Urease inhibitors are kind of a different question, and that, of course, is really specific to how you applied the urea and the weather conditions, the soil conditions, whether you worked it in, and so forth. So that's something completely else. And just a reminder that we absolutely do recommend splitting nitrogen in sandy soils, specifically, and irrigation systems. And so what we kind of say is, there's 4 R's, not just one. It's not just the rate. And so from that standpoint, if we look at those types of soils where we recommend split applying, putting on an inhibitor or putting on a higher rate to compensate for that is probably not really good management, because the most important R there is your timing of your application versus those other practices.
Okay, we had one other question that came in really early. It actually had to do with crop rotation, a little bit different here in terms of if you're not in a conventional corn or corn soybean, are there opportunities here to putting alfalfa credits for the soybeans? Obviously, a small grain. I think we have some of those situations and recommendations in the tables, but still, there's some opportunities. I don't know if any comments from Dan or Brad about taking advantage of that going into here with the higher prices.
And I know somebody had also sent in a question ahead of time about growing oats. You're really kind of venturing off into the economic realm. Maybe you want to get Bill Lazarus on to address some of these overarching crop rotation issues. I guess the one thing I would say to folks, because I can't succinctly answer those questions, is University of Minnesota's Ag Business Management Program, Center for Farm Financial Management, has a website called FinBin, FINBIN, like a financial grain bin. And it's finbin.umn.edu. And it's open to the public. You can go on there and look at summary reports for all sorts of different things. You can look at this regionally. You can look at different crop rotations and so forth. And these are summary of actual adult farm management records. And so you can look at kind of the performance of some of these different things. So that's something that you may want to play with on a rainy day like this and explore yourself.
Liz, I know you put up in the chat box earlier the site for the nitrogen calculator, as well as the University of Minnesota crop nutrient recommendations. So maybe we want to circulate those again and list those situations with that. That would be good. Okay, Dan, I guess this is the last opportunity here. Are there some other things that I know that came in earlier, or other things that you want to mention or address at this point in time? Certainly, you're open for an opportunity if there's some emails that come in later, but kind of an open mic here.
Well, one of the questions I see that somebody put on there was asking about high yields in those areas, whether that would have potentially reduced the amount of residual nitrate, and it could. I mean, it all depends on how much you apply relative to what the crop needs. I mean, really the only way to know would be to take a test. I mean, it's interesting that Brad was showing that roughly 75% of the sites were showing roughly some residual. Now, I don't know if those are all continuous corn, what the rotations were, where they came from, but really the only way to know is just to kind of test on that. I mean, in terms of P and K, and when we look at just overall economics, I mean, we've tried to look at economic models for those two. The thing that I can say, if you're looking at, trying to maintain soil tests, look at the most economical rate, that generally 40 to 60 units, either P2O5 or K2O, that's nutrient. Generally in a 2-year rotation, I've seen it being the most economical. So if you're looking at cutting back rates, generally, some is better than none. We've been able to get if we look at a 2-year application, how much we needed compared to maintenance to maintain soil tests has been roughly 40% of phosphate. Of potash, that number goes up and down so wildly that's kind of an issue with maintenance. And we have a problem with trying to assess that just because of the dry weather conditions. But again, I mean, there's definitely, those are the easiest two we look at cutting. I mean, if you've got soil test data, it's a good time to use it. And if you haven't applied, I I mean, just look if there might be some options there. With that soil test Brad was talking, the PPNT, if you're side dressing, even in the Southeast, you're putting maybe a small starter rate down. If you can get that test taken before you put your initial rate down, I mean, it might be something to look at. I had a site last year that had some high residual nitrate levels. We conducted some nitrogen rate trials on there and had no response to nitrogen. And it would have been in one of those categories likely that the credited amount would have been more than sufficient for what it needed. So there's going to be some situations out there. It's just going to be a question of, can you get the samples pulled before you put the fertilizer down? If you're putting, just a portion of it down in the spring, you have a chance maybe to do some adjustments in season. It might be something to look at if you have that option.
And thanks, Dan. Last words, Brad?
Yep. I'll just wrap it up by saying our nutrient management group has a podcast that we release regularly. We recorded an episode yesterday and talked about some of these things, also maybe some different aspects of it. So you can watch for that, as well as I wrote a blog post on this topic of the pre-plant soil nitrate test. And I see my phone says, based on a Twitter alert, that must have dropped this morning. So you can go look for that blog post also. And that's more of this in writing instead of just listening to me.
Okay. So just to wrap this up, if folks need to look at a little bit more information, pay attention to the crop news as we go through the cropping season. Both these gentlemen, Dan and Brad, as well as Fabian Fernandez, our nitrogen specialist, will be writing some things throughout the season. So if you haven't subscribed to crop news from the University of Minnesota, I really encourage you to do that, because it'll be timely information on crop nutrients. So with that, thanks, Dan and Brad, and maybe they'll be around or can answer some questions in the Q&A or the chat. But we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about weeds and weed science. We have three distinguished guests with us this morning. Dr. Devlin Srangi is our new University of Minnesota Extension weed specialist, primarily dealing with corn and soybeans. Dr. Tom Peters is coming to us from the Red River Valley with, I think, a couple of inches of fresh snow in the Fargo area. But Tom works with the weed control on both sides of the border here, not only North Dakota, but Minnesota as well, in sugar beets, and works on that and weed biology. And then Jared Goplin, coworker of mine, Western Minnesota, based out of the Morris regional office, weed science background, and also knows a lot about what the farming is going on in that particular area and weeds. So with that, we don't have any prescribed presentations, but we did talk a little bit yesterday. There's been some things in the news that just happened yesterday with Enlist that made a significant difference here in the state of Minnesota. So I'm going to turn it over to Devlin here first, and then later on to Tom, and we'll take questions as they come up. So Devlin, why don't you start out?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dave. Hopefully you can hear me well. So yes. Thanks. So yesterday the news came out from EPA that previously, if you can remember, back in January, there was EPA news that 6 counties of Minnesota where you can use Enlist 1, but not Enlist Duo. But that restriction is lifted now. So in all the counties in Minnesota, you can use both Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo. So that's the news came out yesterday from EPA. And there are some other states as well, along with Minnesota, where due to the endangered species, these restrictions were imposed, but now it is lifted now. But at the same time, you have probably seen the news about some additional restrictions on XtendiMax use. So we can talk about that when we proceed in this meeting. But again, there are some restrictions on XtendiMax use, some date cutoff, some temperature cutoff, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, and specifically, we're looking at June 12th, south of I-94, and then, yep. Tom, I believe north of I-94 in Minnesota will be the date of June 30th. The temper restrictions are basically 85 degrees the day of application, and not to exceed that. So that would be prohibited application. So those are the two big. That's been out there. There's really been no change in the last couple of weeks, but it is recent in terms of that label change. I know there's always a recommendation to have all those supplemental labels in your person, or have those available when you are making the application. So whether it's in your vehicle or on your phone, but at least have that available with that. Are there other things, Devlin, kind of going forward here? We talk about efficiency and economics. We know that we're looking at perhaps some limited availability, not only of glyphosate, some of the generic and so forth from overseas, also on glufosinate. A lot of people refer that to as Liberty. In other situations, are there some strategies going forward here in light of all of these changes that people should keep in the back of their mind on a field by field situation?
Sure. Again, like there are some news about herbicide supply shortages, but so far I talked with a few farmers this winter and the spring. They told they don't have any issue yet regarding the supplies, but definitely the price is high, especially for Roundup and other herbicide. The price is high, and now the question comes how we can manage our weeds if the price is high, or if we have limited supply of certain herbicides. So again, first thing, you should know what kind of weed species you are expecting in your field. So whether it is lamb's quarters, or it is pigweeds, or giant ragweed. So because they emerge in the different time, and they have different biological characteristics, and also their management is different, because the herbicide, some of the herbicides that works for pigweed may not work for your giant ragweed. So that is very important to know what weed species you have. And then second thing I want to emphasize here is the use of pre-emergence herbicide, because the pre-emergence herbicides are mostly cheaper. Relatively cheaper, I would say. And also they're really effective. And if you want to start with a clean field and a really strong foundation, I would definitely put some money on pre-emergence herbicide and get some early season weed control, so that you can buy some time for your post-emergence application, as well as the pressure on your post-emergence treatment is not really high. You can use some usual post-emergence herbicide and control pretty much all of your weeds. So pre-emergence herbicide use would be very important at this situation when you are facing some kind of herbicide shortages or some price increase. I would go with pre and then come back with a post-emergence herbicide. And then if possible, I would tank mix some kind of pre-emergence in post-emergence. But again, that will depend on how much weeds you are having, what kind of species you are expecting, and how much money you want to put on your herbicide program for the long run.
Great.
Can I interject? I'd
Tom,
like to add,
yes. Yeah.
I want to reinforce what Devlin just mentioned. So for me, the most important advantage of a pre-herbicide is you're thinning the herd. You're taking out a section of those weeds that are in the field and making it easier to implement a post-emergence strategy. And I think with some uncertainties about availability, that's especially important in 2022. The one disadvantage, or maybe a couple disadvantages of pre's, is you have to apply them at the same time you're planting. So you're multitasking, you're using more equipment, it takes more help in order to implement. So that might be especially a problem this year, since there's some shortages, even of people resources. The other thing that I have to say about pre-emergence herbicides is they don't do any good on the soil surface. We need to get them incorporated into the soil. So we either need to time to a rainfall event or we need to have a tillage application. So which one do you prefer? Well, you know, if I could time to rain, I would much rather have rain incorporate my product. But since I don't have that ability, we do use some tillage from time to time. But I want everybody to hear this. The weeds that are most important for us in 2022 are small seeded broadleaf weeds. And they're in the surface to 1 inch deep in the soil. So don't incorporate too deep if you're going to incorporate. Use a harrow, a flex tine, or equipment that can just cover up the product to get it out of the exposure from the environment, but don't get it too deep.
What are some of those small seeded broadleaf weeds, Tom?
Well, the first one is water hemp. But I think just as important to water hemp is common lamb's quarters. So those are the two that I think are most important. We can debate if we call common ragweed a small seeded broadleaf. I guess I feel that it's a little different than those other two. It takes a slightly different strategy. But Dave, it's lamb's quarters and the pigweeds, and for most people that means water hemp.
Now, from time to time, we have concerns about weeds moving east to west, west to east. And Jared, you've had a lot of experience with giant ragweed. It's not endemic across the entire state, but it is definitely troublesome. Are there any strategies here about planting and timing and letting it come up? And if you have a chance to work the soil on giant ragweed, but you know, we're not talking small seed, we're talking a large seed here.
Yeah, and I guess we'll throw some of the other early emerging weeds. I saw a picture, Tom, of one of your North Dakota consultants had some kochia that he found was emerging already. Kochia is pretty much the first one out of the gate, and giant ragweed's not far behind. Really not long after that soil thaws out and the snow melts. There's going to be some emerging. So those early emerging weeds, tillage still can be a pretty effective management tool. So if you have fields that you have giant ragweed, or in other parts of the state, I have found giant ragweed throughout much of Minnesota, but it's not very common in certain areas. So if you do have issues, in fence lines or those types of areas, even just managing those a little bit differently, even planting them a little bit later if it's in a field that actually makes sense or is feasible. But think about those other mechanical tools, for weed control as well. I know I've heard a lot of people somewhat joke about using the cultivator this year. I think that will be the reality in some of these fields, where weed control has been a challenge. If we don't have some of those tools, if you can't get Liberty or something like that, and you're planning on that, it's a thing where, maybe cultivation is going to be a tool in some of those key acres, right? Or hopefully you don't have weeds really dense across the whole field. It's just in those pockets. So, really, I think strategizing now, if that's even a word, but Tom, I think one of your presentations has that chess piece on it. And I think this year more than ever, I think this is a chess game. We need to think about what our strategies are now and what tools we have in the toolbox and what acres you're going to save that Liberty for, or different products. Which acres are you going to use your Roundup on? Are you going to skip it on your soybeans because you can manage grasses otherwise, and use it on your corn for grass control? All those questions, I guess, really are part of the hard decisions, I guess, this year.
Yeah, the chess game, weeds. So the chess game is that fields aren't all the same. Fields are unique. It's not like a factory where you try to optimize. It's a series of boutiques where you have to do the right decisions for each field. And I think that gets into personalizing thing, and it gets back to how am I going to use my products, which products, when am I going to apply them, that kind of a strategy.
There's a question that came in real quick here about incorporation. I'm going to go back to what Tom was saying before. if you've already planted, whether it's corn or soybeans or even, maybe even sugar beets for that matter, but or other crops, if you have to choose an incorporation tool, if you've already got your seed in place at the proper depths, we oftentimes talk about different things and getting enough incorporation. You're not going to simulate necessarily rainfall, or unless you have irrigation, but any guidance as to the depth. Sometimes we talk about half the depth and so forth, but, rotary hoe, other things that all three of you seen, in other areas. And Devlin's spent time in a drier climate in Nebraska. We had dry year last year. Doesn't mean we will again, but just going ahead, if rain isn't immediate in here, maybe I'll lead that off with Tom, and you other guys can chime in.
Well, I'm going to defer to Devlin. I've talked enough. Devlin, right. You start on this one.
Okay.
Well, you are including two different factors. Number one, certain herbicides like Treflon and like Prowl a little bit, they need some kind of incorporation in the soil right. for better control of the weed and activation of the herbicide. So usually that happens even before planting because, once the seed's on the ground, right. I don't know whether you can do it. But our other herbicide, for example, the group 15s like Dual or Outlook, they usually don't need any kind of incorporation. They're good when you spray on the surface. And now for the drier conditions, whether you want to incorporate or not, I don't know. Because when you till the soil, you lose some moisture again. So I don't know whether you want to incorporate the pre-herbicide, especially in the drier years or not, by doing some tillage. So I would love to hear what Tom says, but maybe that would not be the suggestion from right. my side.
Or and Jared too. What have you seen? I'm old enough to defer back to the rotary hoe, but that's not exclusive.
Tom, I think a couple of years ago you had done some work or talked with Daryl Richardson, right, on weather patterns or something along those lines. And the likelihood of us not getting rain, which is basically what we had last year, is very, very low. So
absolutely,
the likelihood of us having a repeat of last year is very, very, low or minimal. So, in general, the rainfall does come in the spring. But, last year was kind of unique. Hopefully we won't have that again. But otherwise, things like rotary hose, I don't know that any of us, at least I don't have any good experience with that. There's not a lot of incorporation there, really, I think is the problem.
I think Devlin hit the nail on the head. Is a lot of our pre's are chloroacetamide herbicides, and those herbicides do just fine being on the surface. I think, and even last year, it surprised me how long they laid there. And when we finally got rain, I think they did more benefit than we were expecting. So they're very, very resilient products. Really, the only ones I talk about incorporating are these thiocarbamates that sometimes we use in sugar beets. And there's one that goes by the name of Nortron. We can leave it on the surface. We can incorporate it. I find that especially in a dry pattern, that shallow incorporation benefits that particular chemistry.
And that, Tom, would be like with a Flex-Tine harrow or a drag or something along those lines?
And it gets back to the earlier point. Don't get your product too deep. You do two things. You're diluting your product, and you're also moving it to places where you don't have weeds. Our small seeded broadleaves are on the surface to 1 inch deep in the soil.
You want to talk a little bit about water solubility, Tom? You mentioned a couple times this last winter about choices, but there are differences out there.
Yeah, and the thing about water solubility is that herbicides are either soluble, or they tend to want to bind to soil colloids. So that's the absorptivity content. So It's either one or the other. And to some degree that plays off, should I incorporate it or should I leave it on the surface? But even more importantly, Dave, maybe you're fortunate and you do get some rain. Just because you get it into the soil doesn't mean that church is out, that you don't have to worry about weed control any longer. Herbicides in soil need to be in the soil solution. If your soils are very, very dry, the herbicides will move from the soil solution and they'll bind to soil again. This time they're binding to soil below ground. So, you're protecting it from the environment, but they're still not where they need to be, which is in the soil solution. So we still need some moisture to make them effective, even though they're in the ground.
Okay. Maybe going back a little bit to strategies here, if we're talking about, limited, product availability down the line, and that is in terms of our pre-emergence, there are pre-emergence products that are obviously that are the older ones, the metallochlors, the duals, versus we now have quite a few products coming on the market that are mixtures of maybe 1, 2, 3 different active ingredients. Is that a good strategy going forward here in terms of that? And some other from are fairly recent in terms of that, in trying to, quote, cover your bases a little bit more, being a little bit more broad spectrum when we expect concerns about product. You want to talk a little bit about choices within a pre-area in terms of active ingredients and resistance for that issue, how that would fall in. We get that question once in a while too.
Go ahead, Devlin.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So yes, I mean, you have multiple premixes where you have 2, 3, 4 sometimes herbicides, and they're providing at least 2 to 3 sites of action for your weeds. So that's good in both ways. So number one, from wide spectrum weed control, it is always better because probably certain herbicides may control your small seeded broadleaf weeds like pigweeds or lamb squatter may not control the grasses. But when you tank mix 2 products together, you may get grass as well as broadleaf control. So that's always a good idea to increase the spectrum of the weed control. And number 2, that think about, like, if you have 2, 3 to 4 sites of action in a premix, you are exposing certain weed species to multiple sites of action. And from resistance management standpoint, we always say that is a good opportunity. For example, suppose you have a herbicide that has ALS chemistry and PPO chemistry. So now suppose your pigweeds are, let's say some of your pigweeds are resistant to ALS. So they may not respond to your ALS, but PPO herbicide can control them. But rest of your pigweeds, which is susceptible to both ALS and PPO chemistry, they will get exposure to 2 sites of action. So for them, it will be 2 effective sites of action. And for some of them, it will be probably only 1. So you are expanding your control as well as you are exposing them to multiple sites of action. And one thing I want to add here, that pre's are always better to control weeds which are resistant. So recently, my graduate student right now, he is screening some of the water hemp samples collected from Minnesota. And he tested specifically those PPO resistant population like Flexter. And the result is still final result is still, we are waiting to come. But the fresh result, what I saw earlier this week, that the PPO resistant water hemp population was controlled well when you applied pre-emergence herbicide like Valor or flumioxazine. So that means when you are targeting the smaller weeds or seedlings, they're controlled well, even if they're resistant to post-emergence PPO like Flexter or Cobra. So from resistance management standpoint, it is also a good idea to use pre's as well as premix pre's.
I want to talk a little bit. We had a question. We talked about this earlier, last couple of days ago, and that is if you are don't want to apply glyphosate or can't find it, or it's limited, or for whatever reason, we have a number of post-grass herbicides that are on the market. But what are some things that people need to remember about whether it's Select Max or Sure, and in terms of height of grasses and antagonism? And also the fact that they're going to be limited on a perennial grass like quackgrass in terms of a rate. But any comments there, Tom and Jared? And I think, Tom, they're in the North Dakota Weed Control Guide. They can download. There are some tables that go on a little bit about the height restrictions on these, but comments about that, and it relates to volunteer corn, which is a concern too.
So I'm going to leave the important stuff to Devlin, but I want to say a couple of things about the post-grass herbicides. So the first thing I want to say is check the label to see if the particular herbicide you're using requires an adjuvant. A lot of these products perform better when they're in combination with an adjuvant. So that's the first one. The second one, I'm a big believer in spray quality, which is droplet size, and that's especially important as weeds get bigger. So check to find out what's the right size, droplet size, and maybe coverage, which leads to spray volume a little bit that can optimize the use of these products. And then Devlin, you can teach us about some of the antagonism issues.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Those are great points, actually. So this grass herbicides, they're definitely stage dependent, and sometimes they're also environment driven. But some of my colleagues in the US, they did some studies where they tried to control grasses using this grass herbicide, tank mixing them with growth regulator like Enlist 1 or Extendimax. And what they found is these grass herbicides are showing some kind of antagonism. So if you want to tank mix them, you have to increase the rate of this grass killer to get optimum control of the grass. So that's why always it is recommended go with 2-pass program. So if you want to use this grass killer, maybe apply your grass killer first and come back with your Extendimax or Enlist 1 or vice versa. But if you tank mix them, often they show some kind of antagonism and reduced control. So in that case, you have to increase the grass killer's rate. So I think that's what, Tom, you wanted to mention regarding the antagonism. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's another quick question here, and I'm bring Jared back in on. He's had some experience there, and it's came in is about cover crops. If you plant green, and we can define what that planting green is, obviously planting, like say, for example, soybeans into a standing cover crop or any of them. If you plant green, will their roots take the herbicide down? And in terms of that, I suppose in situations with that, if you're making an application, you want to comment anything about a timing there in a cover crop situation, Jared?
I guess depends on where this question is coming from. If it's coming from terminating the cover crop, if you put a systemic herbicide like Roundup on it, it will move in the plant. So in that case, systemic products will move down. But if we talk about pre-emerge products, and I know that's one of the sort of concerns we have when we do plant green or into cover crop residue, is how that residue might interact with some of our pre-emerge herbicides or other things. If it's going to interact or intercept some of that those products and make them work not as well. And I don't have any direct experience working with that. I don't know, Tom or Devlin, if you have any comments on using pre's or residual products with cover crops.
I do, and in my case, we call them nurse crops or companion crops because they're seeded in the spring. And there's a couple of things that I've learned along the way. So, Joan, if you can give your cover crops a head start, if you can give them a head start, I think there's a good opportunity that you can make them work. You can use soil residual herbicides for water hemp control and still get the benefit of your cover crops. The other thing is some of the shoot uptake herbicides, like the chloroacetamide, tend to be a little safer with cover crops. And I'm thinking about the grass cover crops, the cereal grains. I use some root uptake herbicides in sugar beets, and they're usually pretty hard on the cover crops. So think of the size of the cover crops, giving the cover crops a head start, and then the compound, the herbicide itself, and how the herbicides work, either shoot uptake or root uptake.
And two things I want to add here, Tom. So number one, sometimes when you are doing planting green, if your cover crop canopy is really dense and you got really good establishment and biomass, sometimes the pre-herbicides, like part of the pre-herbicide may not reach to the ground due to the deposition. So it may land on your cover crop, and then underneath the canopy, you might have less herbicide concentration. That's what I have seen in some of the studies done by my colleagues. And number two, sometimes those cover crops definitely increase the organic matter in the soil, and there is a chance of fixing of the pre-herbicides, but I have not seen that is a big of a concern so far for my colleagues. Again, I don't have much experience working with cover crop. We just started one big trial last fall. So I can probably report to you back in the future. But I think that is also a concern for some of the grower that fixes on of pre-herbicide. But again, I think more concern is if you have a dense cover crop canopy, whether the pre-herbicide is landing on the ground or not.
Okay, well, we're to the end of our time allotment here. We want to thank our panelists. Again, Dr. Devlin Sarangi from the University of Minnesota, Dr. Tom Peters, University of Minnesota and North Dakota State University, sugar beet weed specialist, and Jared Goplin, crops educator here with the University of Minnesota. I want to mention, and Jared, maybe you can unmute yourself for just a second. This is the last installment of the strategic farming for this year, so we appreciate everyone's attention. However, we will be starting our summer program, our field notes program, Jared, I believe in May, so stay tuned for that. Any comments on that? But that's a little bit more in terms of opportunity of things come up in terms of topics as opposed to planned out, but we do have some plans in the works.
Yep, stay tuned to Crop News. And make sure you subscribe to the Field Notes Summer Strategic Farming Program, where we'll hopefully be a little bit more responsive to any issues as they come up during the growing season. So, or if you have other topics that you want us to cover during the summer season, if you see things out in the field, have questions, we'd love to cover those. So make sure you let us know.
Okay. So again, thanks for attending today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. When you leave, there's a very short 3-question survey. We want to thanks again to our sponsors, not only for today, but for the entire season here of Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops. And that's, again, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, along with the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. We thank them for our support. We thank our panelists throughout the year. If you go to the Strategic Farming webpage here in a week, this recording will be up. Also, you'll be able to look back and listen to previous presentations that started back throughout the winter and pick those up as well in terms of timely opportunities going forward. Again, subscribe to Crop News. We have some things in the chat box mentioned about weed control that were put up by Liz. I want to thank her for helping out with this North Dakota Weed Control Guide and other things and information that are with that. But please subscribe to Crop News and Up to Date. But again, look for our webinar program again to start in the month of May. And we'll certainly have very important topics to talk about as the weather impacts the 2022 crop season going forward. Liz, any last comments? You're kind of the behind the scenes and originator here. We thank you for all your efforts and time in terms of the audience. But I believe that's all the notes that I have at this point.
No, we just thank everybody again for attending. And like Dave was mentioning, if there's anything you missed, feel free to check our website, and we'll have those recordings of every session plus previous years as well. And we look forward to having you join us in the field notes this summer. And
we really want to thank Rick behind the scenes here, operating here, support staff, and appreciate Rick's opportunity to get up early and keep us all going here on the webinar program, make things happen behind the curtain, so to speak. So thanks again to Rick and Phyllis Bongard as well. So with that, again, thank you for attending and for the final installment here of our season of strategic farming. And we look forward to seeing many of you in the month of May, Jared, with field notes, and maybe the snow will stop by then. We'll all be back in the field. So thanks again, and have a good spring.